Have you ever felt something watching you from the shadows? Not an animal, not a person, something other voice drops to whisper, "I have." And I made the mistake of bringing it home. The day I found those ancient coins on my doorstep was the day I invited death into my family. My sister's mysterious illness, the whispers that followed me everywhere, the nightmares of pale fingers reaching through soil, clawing toward me. I thought burying the gold would end it. I was wrong, so terribly wrong. What grew from that spot wasn't a plant. It was hands. Dozens of them, human-like but impossibly pale, pushing through the earth, reaching for the sky, for me, for anyone who came close. They say every debt must be paid, but no one told me the price would be measured in blood, and that my family had been making payments for generations. This is my confession, my warning, because the handman is still waiting for someone just like you. Urgent whisper, and it's so very patient. Morgan Thorne's fingers trembled as he dug into the dark soil beneath the ancient oak. The weight of the small cloth pouch in his pocket seemed impossibly heavy, as if the gold coins inside were made of lead rather than precious metal. Moonlight filtered through the branches above, casting dappled shadows across his face, as sweat beaded on his forehead, despite the autumn chill. "Just a little deeper," he whispered to himself, a habit he'd developed during the long months of isolation. "Just deep enough that no one will find it." The shovel struck something hard, and Morgan flinched, his heart racing. But it was only a rock, and he carefully moved it aside before continuing to dig. His mind drifted back to 6 months earlier, when everything had still been normal. Before the dreams began, before the whispers, before his sister's mysterious illness. The gold had appeared on his doorstep on a rainy April morning, nestled in a wooden box with no note, no explanation. Just 7 ancient coins, each engraved with symbols he didn't recognize. He'd assumed it was a gift from a distant relative, or perhaps a mistake. How could he have known that by bringing them into his home, he'd invited something else in as well? Morgan wiped his brow with a dirt-stained sleeve, his eyes darting nervously to the darkness beyond the oak's protective canopy. The forest surrounding his family's property had always felt like home, but tonight it seemed to watch him with malevolent interest. He could almost feel eyes following his movements, patient and hungry. "It ends tonight," he said firmly, trying to convince himself as much as whatever might be listening. "I'm giving it back." The hole was finally deep enough. Morgan reached into his pocket and withdrew the cloth pouch. For a moment he hesitated. The coin seemed to pulse with warmth against his palm, almost like a heartbeat. A fleeting desire to open the pouch, to look at the gold one last time, washed over him. But he resisted. He knew better now. With a decisive motion, he dropped the pouch into the hole and began to shovel dirt over it, his movements becoming increasingly frantic. When the last of the soil was tamped down, he stepped back, exhaling a shaky breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "It's done," he whispered. "Please let it be enough." As Morgan turned to leave, he failed to notice the slight movement in the freshly disturbed earth behind him, a barely perceptible ripple, like something taking root. 3 weeks passed, and life began to resemble normalcy again. Autumn deepened, painting the countryside in brilliant reds and golds. Morgan's sister Eliza recovered from her mysterious ailment, color returning to her cheeks for the first time in months. The nightmares that had plagued Morgan, visions of shadowy figures offering handfuls of gold, of fingers emerging from the earth, gradually faded. He sat at the kitchen table in his small cottage, sunlight streaming through the windows as he thumbed through a book without really reading it. A cup of coffee cooled beside him, the steam curling upward in delicate tendrils. "You look better," remarked Eliza as she entered the kitchen, her long hair tied back in a loose braid. "Not so haunted anymore," Morgan smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I feel better. How about you? No more fevers?" Eliza shook her head, reaching for her own mug on the counter. "Not for 2 weeks now. Whatever it was seems to have passed." She hesitated, then added, "I had the strangest dream last night, though." Morgan's fingers tightened around his book. "Oh, I dreamt about hands, she said, stirring honey into her tea. Dozens of them growing from the ground like plants. They were reaching for something. She laughed nervously. Bizarre, right? The book slipped from Morgan's grasp, landing on the table with a dull thud. Eliza gave him a curious look. Just a dream, he said, forcing lightness into his voice. Probably from that horror film you watched. But later, after Eliza had gone, Morgan found himself drawn to the window that faced the ancient oak. From this distance, everything appeared normal. The tree stood as it always had, solid and reassuring against the autumn sky. Yet something tugged at him, an uneasy feeling he couldn't shake. That evening, as dusk painted the sky in watercolors of purple and orange, Morgan walked toward the oak. The air grew colder with each step, unnaturally so, until his breath fogged before him. When he reached the spot where he'd buried the coins, he stopped abruptly, the blood draining from his face. The ground had changed. What had been flat earth was now slightly raised, as if something beneath was pushing upward. And there, breaking through the soil, was what looked like a finger. Not a plant, not a root, but unmistakably a human finger, pale and perfect, pointing toward the darkening sky. Morgan staggered backward, bile rising in his throat. As his heel caught on a root, he fell, his head striking the ground. The last thing he saw before losing consciousness was the finger seeming to curl slightly, as if beckoning him closer. "You're sure you didn't hit your head before you fell?" Dr. Abernathy asked, shining a light in Morgan's eyes. "Memory can be tricky with concussions." Morgan sat on the examination table, the paper crinkling beneath him as he shifted uncomfortably. "I'm positive. I saw something, and then I fell." The doctor made a non-committal noise, jotting notes in Morgan's file. "And what exactly did you see that frightened you so badly?" How could he possibly explain? That he'd buried cursed gold, and now it was growing into something impossible. Instead, Morgan mumbled about seeing what he thought was an animal, perhaps a wounded one. "Well, your vitals are normal, and your pupils are responding appropriately," Dr. Abernathy said, stepping back. "I'd say you're fine physically, but I'm a bit concerned about these episodes of yours. First the insomnia, now this. Have you considered talking to someone?" Morgan nodded absently, already planning his return to the oak. He needed to see if what he'd witnessed was real or just another manifestation of his increasingly fragile mental state. On the drive home, the radio stuttered between stations before settling on an old folk song about a man who made a deal with the devil. Morgan quickly switched it off, his hands trembling slightly on the steering wheel. Eliza was waiting when he arrived, concern etched on her face. Dr. Abernathy called ahead. "Said you had some sort of episode?" "It's nothing," Morgan assured her, avoiding her searching gaze. "Just stress, probably." "Morgan," her voice softened. "What's going on with you? Ever since spring, you've been different, distant, scared of something." She touched his arm gently. "You can tell me." For a moment he considered it. The weight of the secret had been crushing him for months. But how could he explain without sounding completely insane? How could he tell her that he believed their family was cursed because of gold he'd accepted, that he thought he'd seen a finger growing from the earth? "I just need some rest," he said finally, patting her hand. "Everything will be fine." That night, Morgan dreamed of the oak tree. In his dream, he approached it slowly, drawn by an invisible force. The ground beneath the tree had split open, revealing not dirt, but a tangle of arms reaching upward, their fingers intertwining to form the trunk and branches of a grotesque parody of a tree. And hanging from those finger branches like fruit were the gold coins. Glinting in the moonlight as he watched in horror, one of the hands detached itself and began to crawl toward him, dragging itself across the ground with surprising speed. Just as its cold fingers closed around his ankle, Morgan jerked awake, a silent scream trapped in his throat. Dawn was still hours away, but he knew sleep would not return. Outside his window, the oak tree stood silhouetted against the night sky, calling to him. The librarian eyed Morgan curiously as he requested books on demonology and ancient curses. "School project?" she asked, adjusting her glasses. Research for a novel, he lied. Avoiding her gaze, the local library was small, but its collection on folklore and the occult was surprisingly extensive, thanks to the region's rich history of superstition. Morgan spent hours poring over dusty volumes, searching for anything that might explain what was happening at the oak tree. He'd returned to the site that morning, half convinced he'd imagined the finger. But what he found was worse than his memory suggested. The raised earth had grown larger, and now 3 distinct fingers protruded from the soil, longer than before, the nails perfectly formed. They seemed to reach toward the sky in supplication or perhaps accusation. In a book titled Cursed Objects Throughout History, Morgan found a brief mention of the Devil's Payment, gold coins said to be minted from metal, taken from hell itself, given as payment for souls. The text described how those who accepted such payment would suffer misfortune until the debt was repaid. "But I did repay it," Morgan muttered to himself, earning a sharp look from a nearby patron. "I buried it." I gave it back. As closing time approached, the librarian appeared at his table. "Finding everything you need?" Morgan glanced up, startled. "Yes, thank you. Just finishing up," she nodded, then hesitated. "You know, if you're interested in local folklore, you might want to talk to Mrs. Blackwood. She lives out past the Miller farm, keeps to herself mostly, but she knows all the old stories. Her family goes back generations here." "Mrs. Blackwood," Morgan repeated, committing the name to memory. Outside, the day had grown dark with heavy clouds, promising rain. As Morgan walked to his car, he felt a sharp pain in his palm. Looking down, he saw a small cut had opened across his lifeline, blood welling up and dripping onto the pavement. He hadn't touched anything sharp, hadn't felt anything cut him. The first drops of rain fell as he drove toward home, growing quickly into a downpour that made visibility difficult. Through the rhythmic sweep of windshield wipers, Morgan caught a glimpse of something on the roadside, a figure standing motionless in the rain. Arm outstretched as if hailing him, he slowed instinctively, peering through the grey curtain of water. The figure seemed to have too many arms, or perhaps it was just a trick of the rain and his tired eyes. When lightning flashed, illuminating the scene for a brief moment, there was nothing there at all. By the time Morgan reached his cottage, his hands were shaking so badly he dropped his keys twice before managing to unlock the door. Inside, he found Eliza sitting in the dark living room, staring out the window. "Eliza, are you okay?" She turned to him slowly, her expression vacant. "They're calling to us, Morgan," she said, her voice oddly flat. "Can't you hear them?" "Who's calling?" he asked, a chill running down his spine. Eliza blinked, confusion crossing her face. "What? I don't know what I was saying." She rubbed her temples. "I have such a headache suddenly." Morgan helped her to bed, then stood at his own bedroom window, watching the rain lash against the glass as lightning periodically illuminated the silhouette of the oak tree in the distance. Something was very wrong, and it was spreading beyond him now. Touching Eliza, he had to find answers, had to stop whatever was happening. Tomorrow, he decided, he would visit Mrs. Blackwood. Mrs. Blackwood's cottage sat nestled against the edge of the forest, almost camouflaged by the surrounding vegetation. Smoke curled from a stone chimney, and wind chimes made of bones and shells clattered softly in the breeze. Morgan hesitated at the gate, second-guessing his decision to come here. But the memory of Eliza's vacant stare propelled him forward. He knocked on the weathered door, the sound seeming to echo in the stillness of the clearing. The woman who answered was not what he expected. Rather than the ancient crone he'd imagined, Mrs. Blackwood appeared to be in her 60s, with sharp eyes and silver hair pulled back in a neat bun. She wore jeans and a flannel shirt, looking more like a retired teacher than a keeper of arcane knowledge. "You must be Morgan Thorne," she said, surprising him. "I've been expecting you." Before he could ask how she knew his name, she ushered him inside. The cottage was warm and smelled of herbs and wood smoke. Every surface was crowded with books, jars of dried plants, and curious objects Morgan couldn't identify. "Tea," she offered, already moving toward a copper kettle. "How did you know I was coming?" Morgan asked, remaining standing as she busied herself with cups and leaves. Mrs. Blackwood smiled over her shoulder. "News travels fast in small towns. Librarian called me. Said a young man was asking about curses and demons, looking like he'd seen a ghost." She set the kettle on the stove. "Besides, I've been watching your family for some time now. Ever since the gold arrived." Morgan felt the blood drain from his face. "You know about the gold?" "Sit," she said firmly, pointing to a worn armchair. "This is a long conversation." Once they were settled with steaming cups of a tea that tasted of earth and something bitter Morgan couldn't identify. Mrs. Blackwood leaned forward. "Your family has a history with what locals used to call the handman's gold. Goes back to your great-great-grandfather, Ephraim Thorne." She took a sip of tea. "He was the one who first made the deal." "What deal?" Morgan asked, his cup forgotten in his hands. "Ephraim wanted land, lots of it. The forest was set to be divided among several families, but he wanted it all. Story goes, he met someone at the crossroads who offered him 7 gold coins. Said if he buried them on the property line, the other families would abandon their claims." She paused. "They did. One by one they sold to Ephraim for almost nothing. After suffering terrible misfortunes, Morgan thought of the family property, the vast stretch of forest that had always seemed too large for what his ancestors had been, simple farmers. As far as he knew, the gold always finds its way back to a thorn. Every few generations," Mrs. Blackwood continued, "and with it the obligation. Your ancestors learned to pass it along quickly, to bury it on someone else's land, letting the curse transfer to them. But you—" Her eyes narrowed. "You tried to give it back, didn't you?" Morgan nodded slowly. "I buried it under the oak. I thought that would end it." Mrs. Blackwood set her cup down with a sharp click. "The oak marks the center of the original property. You didn't give the gold away, Morgan. You planted it in your own soil." She leaned closer. "And now it's growing." "What exactly is growing?" Morgan demanded, though he already knew. The image of those pale fingers pushing through the soil flashed in his mind. "The handman collects debts," Mrs. Blackwood said simply. "Your great-great-grandfather made a deal, but he never fully paid. The gold was meant to be passed along, each new owner adding to the handman's harvest. By burying it on your own land, you've essentially called in the debt. All of it." Morgan set down his tea, his appetite for it gone. "What happens now?" Mrs. Blackwood's expression softened slightly. "I don't know exactly. The stories vary. But I do know this. The growth will continue until the full debt is collected." "And what is the full debt?" She hesitated. "Lives, Morgan. The handman deals in lives." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the ticking of an antique clock and the distant call of a crow outside. "How do I stop it?" Morgan finally asked. Mrs. Blackwood sighed. "There are always ways to negotiate with such entities, but they come at a cost. The question is what you're willing to pay." She rose and moved to a bookshelf, extracting a thin volume bound in faded leather. "This contains rituals for binding and bargaining. I can't promise it will work, but it's a starting point." As Morgan reached for the book, their fingers brushed, and he felt a jolt of something. Recognition, perhaps. Or warning. "Be careful," Mrs. Blackwood said softly. "The handman is clever. It will try to trick you, to make you think you've won, when you're only sinking deeper into its grasp." Morgan left with the book tucked safely in his jacket, feeling both more informed and more terrified than when he'd arrived. On the drive home, he found himself checking the rear-view mirror frequently, unable to shake the feeling that something was following him. Just out of sight, when he pulled up to his cottage, he noticed Eliza's car was gone. Inside, he found a note on the kitchen counter. "Went to the oak. Something calling me there." "Don't worry," cold dread washed over him. The note was in Eliza's handwriting, but the phrasing was wrong, mechanical. Without bothering to grab a jacket, Morgan sprinted toward the ancient oak, his heart hammering in his chest. The sun was setting as he reached the tree, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold. In the fading light, he saw Eliza standing motionless before the disturbed earth where the coins were buried. And what was growing there now made his knees buckle. A grotesque sculpture of hands had emerged from the soil, interlaced fingers forming a trunk about 2 feet tall. At the top, palms faced outward like bizarre blossoms, their centers gleaming with what looked like gold coins embedded in the flesh. "Eliza," Morgan called, approaching cautiously. "Eliza, step away from there." She turned to him, her eyes glassy and unfocused. "It's so beautiful, isn't it? They're reaching for us, Morgan. They want to welcome us home." As Morgan moved closer, he saw that the ground around the hand tree was strewn with small objects: Eliza's earrings, her watch, her car keys, offerings. "Eliza, listen to me," he said, keeping his voice calm despite his rising panic. "That thing isn't good. It's dangerous. We need to go back to the house." "But it's growing," she said, smiling dreamily. "It needs nourishment. It needs more gold, more gifts." She reached into her pocket and withdrew something that caught the last rays of sunlight, their mother's wedding ring. A family heirloom Eliza always wore on a chain around her neck. As she moved to place it at the base of the grotesque tree, Morgan lunged forward, grabbing her wrist. "No!" For a moment they struggled, and then suddenly Eliza blinked, confusion replacing the vacant look in her eyes. "Morgan, what's happening? Why are we here?" Before he could answer, a soft sound came from the hand tree, a rustling, a shifting. The fingers that formed the trunk began to move, to uncurl slowly, and one of the hands detached itself, dropping to the ground with a dull thud, before beginning to drag itself toward them, fingers digging into the soil for purchase. "Run," Morgan whispered, pulling Eliza back. "Run!" "I don't remember going to the oak," Eliza said for the 3rd time, huddled under a blanket on Morgan's couch. Her face was pale, her hands still trembling slightly. "The last thing I remember is making lunch, and then nothing until you were there, grabbing my arm." Morgan paced the small living room, occasionally glancing out the window toward the oak tree, though it was now hidden by darkness. He'd retrieved as many of Eliza's belongings as he could before fleeing, but her car keys remained behind, left in his panic. "It's like sleepwalking," he suggested, not wanting to frighten her further with talk of possession or influence. "Maybe a side effect of your illness." Eliza shook her head. "This is connected to whatever's been wrong with you, isn't it? The nightmares, the way you've been acting. And that thing I saw by the tree," she shuddered. "It looked like hands, Morgan. Human hands growing from the ground," unable to deny what she'd seen with her own eyes. Morgan finally told her everything. The gold that had appeared on their doorstep, the research he'd done, his conversation with Mrs. Blackwood, and what he feared was happening now. Eliza listened in silence, her expression shifting from disbelief to horror to a strange sort of resigned acceptance. When he finished, she simply asked, "What do we do now?" Morgan retrieved Mrs. Blackwood's book from where he'd hidden it in a kitchen cabinet. "We try to stop it. Tonight." The ritual described in the book was deceptively simple. Create a circle of salt around the entity, burn specific herbs, and recite an incantation that would bind the handman, preventing it from growing further. Then offer an alternative payment to settle the debt, something of significant value to the summoner. "What will you offer?" Eliza asked, as they gathered the necessary supplies. Morgan hesitated. "The book says it has to be something truly precious to me, something irreplaceable." His hand unconsciously moved to his chest, where beneath his shirt hung a locket containing a small photograph of their parents, taken shortly before the accident that claimed their lives. "No," Eliza said firmly, understanding immediately. "There has to be another way, another payment." "It's just a thing, Eliza," Morgan argued, though his voice betrayed his reluctance. "If it works, it's worth it." As they prepared to return to the oak, Morgan's phone rang, an unknown number. He answered cautiously. "Don't do the ritual." Mrs. Blackwood's voice came through, urgent and strained. "I've found something else in the town records. The binding won't work. It'll only make things worse. What should we do instead?" Morgan asked, signaling to Eliza to pause her preparations. "Meet me at the crossroads near your property," Mrs. Blackwood said. "Bring nothing from the book. I'll explain when you get there." The line went dead. Morgan stared at the phone, indecision warring within him. "We should go," Eliza said, already reaching for her coat. "She knows more about this than we do." The crossroads was a 10-minute drive from their cottage, a lonely intersection of dirt roads rarely used since the new highway had been built. As they approached, their headlights illuminated a figure standing in the center, Mrs. Blackwood, her silver hair almost luminous in the darkness. Morgan parked, and they cautiously approached her. Something felt off, though he couldn't pinpoint what. "Thank you for coming," Mrs. Blackwood said, her voice oddly formal. "I've found a solution to your problem. What is it?" Morgan asked, stopping a few feet away from her. "The debt must be transferred, not paid," she explained. "Someone must willingly accept the gold and take it far from here, breaking the connection to your land." "Who would do that?" Eliza asked, voicing Morgan's own question. Mrs. Blackwood smiled, and in that smile Morgan finally realized what was wrong. Her eyes, always sharp and clear, were now glassy, unfocused, just as Eliza's had been at the oak. "I would," Mrs. Blackwood said, extending her hand. In her palm lay a single gold coin, glinting in the moonlight. "All you need to do is give me the rest, and your debt will be settled." Morgan took an instinctive step back, pulling Eliza with him. "You don't have the rest of the coins. They're buried, growing into that thing?" "Yes," Mrs. Blackwood agreed, her smile widening unnaturally. "So we must go there together. You must help me harvest them." As she spoke, Morgan noticed something emerging from the shadows behind her. Hands, dozens of them, crawling across the ground like pale spiders. Fingers digging into the dirt to pull themselves forward. "Eliza," Morgan whispered. "Get back to the car, now." They barely made it back to the cottage. The car fishtailing on the dirt road as Morgan drove recklessly fast. Behind them in the rearview mirror, he glimpsed Mrs. Blackwood standing motionless at the crossroads, surrounded by those crawling hands, watching their retreat with an unnatural stillness. "She's being controlled." "Like I was," Eliza said, her voice shaking as they barricaded the cottage doors. "That thing, the handman, it's using her." Morgan nodded grimly, pulling curtains closed over every window. "And it tried to trick us into helping it collect the coins. The question is why? If the gold is already planted and growing, why does it need us to harvest it?" They retreated to the kitchen, the furthest point from any doors or windows. Morgan spread Mrs. Blackwood's book on the table, searching for answers they might have missed. "Here," Eliza said, pointing to a passage near the end. "It says the handman's power grows with each transaction. It doesn't just want the gold returned. It wants it passed along to a new victim. That's how it feeds, on the chain of debt and misfortune." Morgan read further, his blood running cold. "And if the chain is broken, if someone tries to end it by burying the gold on their own land, it manifests physically to restore the cycle," Eliza finished. "That's what's happening at the oak. It's creating a physical form to find new victims." A soft, scratching sound came from the front door, like fingernails dragging across wood. Then another from a window and another. "They were surrounded. We need to destroy it," Morgan said, flipping frantically through the book. "There has to be a way." Eliza gripped his arm suddenly. "Morgan, look." She pointed to a paragraph describing the handman's origin. "It says here that the entity was once human, a moneylender who was murdered by his debtors. His hands were cut off as a warning to others. The gold coins were made from jewelry melted down and mixed with his blood. How does that help us?" Morgan asked, the scratching growing louder, more insistent. "His remains were buried at a crossroads, unconsecrated ground." Eliza continued reading. "That's why the crossroads is significant. And look, the only way to truly destroy such an entity is to—" A loud crash interrupted her as something heavy hit the front door. Morgan grabbed a kitchen knife, positioning himself between Eliza and the sound. "To what?" he demanded. "To return what was taken," Eliza said, her eyes wide. "The hands. They have to be buried at the crossroads with the gold. It's a full circle. The gold and the hands must be reunited with the original remains." The front door splintered with a deafening crack. Through the gap they could see hands, dozens of them, pushing through, fingers working to widen the opening. "We have to get to the oak," Morgan said, grabbing his car keys from the counter. And then to the crossroads. How? We're surrounded! Morgan's gaze fell on a container of salt they'd gathered for the ritual. The book said salt repels it. We make a path. Working quickly, they filled 2 large jars with salt. Then, taking a deep breath, Morgan approached the breaking door, Eliza close behind him. As the first hand pushed fully through the gap, reaching blindly, he poured salt directly onto it. The effect was immediate and horrifying. The hand convulsed, the fingers curling in agony, and a high, thin sound, like distant screaming, filled the air. The hand retreated, and Morgan poured more salt across the threshold. "Now!" he shouted, yanking the damaged door open. They sprinted for the car, tossing handfuls of salt at any hands that came too close. The drive to the oak was a nightmare. Hands emerged from the darkness, reaching for the car, forcing Morgan to swerve repeatedly. When they finally reached the tree, what they saw stole their breath. The hand tree had grown to over 6 feet tall, a grotesque tangle of arms and fingers forming a trunk that twisted upward. At the top, instead of branches, dozens of hands reached outward, palms up, each holding a gold coin that gleamed in the moonlight. And at the base, more detached hands circled restlessly like guards. How do we get past those? Eliza whispered. Morgan gripped the salt jar tightly. We run! The moment they left the car, the hands at the base of the tree sensed them, turning with eerie coordination to face the newcomers. Morgan and Eliza moved forward cautiously, tossing salt to clear a path. The coins are the key, Morgan said, eyeing the gleaming gold nestled in the palms at the top of the tree. We need to get them all. They were 5 feet from the tree when a familiar figure stepped from behind it, Mrs. Blackwood. Her movement stiff and unnatural. You can't stop it, she said, but the voice wasn't entirely hers. It was deeper, with an odd echo. The debt must be paid. The cycle must continue. Mrs. Blackwood, Eliza called, if you can hear me, you need to fight it. It's controlling you. The older woman's expression flickered, a moment of awareness crossing her face before the vacant look returned. Too late for her, the voice said through her lips. Too late for all of you. The handman always collects. As she spoke, the tree behind her began to move, the hands that formed its trunk unclenching and rearranging themselves, reaching outward. The coins tumbled from the palms at the top, falling to the ground with metallic clinks. The gold! Morgan shouted, lunging forward. He threw a handful of salt at Mrs. Blackwood, making her shriek and stumble backward, momentarily clearing the way. Eliza darted past her, dropping to her knees to gather the fallen coins. There are more than 7, she called, confusion in her voice. Much more. Morgan glanced back and saw she was right. Dozens of gold coins now lay scattered around the base of the tree, far more than had originally been in the pouch he'd buried. It's been collecting, he realized. All these generations, all these transactions. These are all the coins it's ever passed along. As Eliza scooped coins into her pockets, the hands from the tree began to detach themselves, dropping to the ground one by one. The tree was dismantling itself, becoming an army of crawling hands that moved with increasing speed toward them. We have enough, Morgan shouted, grabbing Eliza's arm. We need to get to the crossroads. They ran for the car, hands close behind them. As Morgan fumbled with the keys, one latched onto his ankle, its grip icy cold and surprisingly strong. He cried out, kicking frantically, unable to dislodge it. Eliza dumped the last of their salt directly on the hand, and it released Morgan with that same high, distant scream. They threw themselves into the car and sped away, the headlights illuminating a surreal scene in the rearview mirror. Dozens of hands skittering across the ground in pursuit, with Mrs. Blackwood walking stiffly behind them, her arms hanging unnaturally at her sides. What do we do when we get there? Eliza asked, clutching the coins in her lap. The book didn't explain exactly how to return the hands. Morgan gripped the steering wheel tightly. I think we have to dig, find the original remains, and bury the hands and gold with them. The crossroads appeared ahead, eerily quiet in the moonlight. Morgan parked at the center, and they got out cautiously, half expecting an ambush of hands. But the intersection was deserted. Where do we dig? Eliza asked, looking around at the 4 dirt roads extending outward. Morgan closed his eyes, trying to remember what he'd read. Crossroads burials were usually done at the exact center where the roads meet. They had no shovels, only their hands, but the soil was soft enough to dig with some effort. As they worked, Morgan kept glancing up, watching for signs of pursuit. The night remained quiet, too quiet, without even the usual sounds of insects or nocturnal animals. After 10 minutes of desperate digging, Eliza's fingers struck something solid. "I found something!" They cleared away more soil to reveal a small wooden box, ancient and rotting, but still intact. Morgan carefully lifted it from the hole. The lid was sealed with what looked like hardened wax, imprinted with a symbol similar to those on the gold coins. "Should we open it?" Eliza asked, her voice hushed, before Morgan could answer. The stillness of the night was shattered by the sound of approaching footsteps, slow, measured, and accompanied by the soft scratching of many things moving across dirt. "They found us," he said, looking up to see Mrs. Blackwood's silhouette at the edge of the crossroads, the army of hands flowing around her like a pale tide. "We're out of time." Morgan broke the wax seal with trembling fingers and lifted the lid of the box. Inside lay 2 desiccated human hands, blackened with age but unmistakable. Between them was a small leather pouch, similar to the one that had contained the original 7 coins. "The original moneylender," Eliza whispered, her face pale in the moonlight. "This is what's left of him." The approaching footsteps grew louder, and Morgan looked up to see Mrs. Blackwood standing at the edge of their hastily dug hole, the vacant expression still fixed on her face. Behind her, the hands had stopped their advance, arrayed in a semicircle like an audience awaiting a performance. "Return what was taken," the voice that wasn't quite Mrs. Blackwood's commanded. "Complete the circle. The coins," Morgan said to Eliza, keeping his eyes on the unnatural gathering. "Put them in the pouch." As Eliza carefully transferred the gold coins into the ancient leather pouch, Morgan addressed the entity controlling Mrs. Blackwood. "If we do this, it ends. No more debt, no more curse on our family. Is that the deal?" A smile spread across Mrs. Blackwood's face, too wide to be natural. "The debt will be settled. The cycle will be complete." There was something in the phrasing that made Morgan uneasy, but they had no other options. Once the coins were secure in the pouch, he placed it back between the desiccated hands in the box. "Now what?" he asked, looking at the grotesque assembly of living hands still waiting expectantly. "They must return as well," the entity said through Mrs. Blackwood. "All the hands, all the parts of me that have grown in your soil." As if responding to a signal, the detached hands began to move forward, crawling toward the hole. One by one they dropped in, arranging themselves around the box in a bizarre pattern, fingers intertwining with the desiccated remains. "This will work?" Eliza whispered to Morgan. "This will save us?" "It has to," he replied, though doubt gnawed at him. Something still felt wrong, incomplete. The last of the crawling hands joined the macabre pile in the hole. Mrs. Blackwood stepped forward, standing at the very edge. "Now," she said, the eerie voice growing stronger, "it must be sealed." "With blood." "As it was begun, whose blood?" Morgan demanded, instinctively moving in front of Eliza. Mrs. Blackwood's face split into that too wide smile again. "The blood of a thorn, of course. The family that first accepted the gold, that first broke faith." Before Morgan could react, Mrs. Blackwood lunged forward with unexpected speed, producing a knife that flashed in the moonlight. He raised his arm defensively, and the blade sliced across his palm, drawing a line of dark blood that immediately began to drip. "Morgan!" Eliza cried, grabbing him and pulling him back, but Mrs. Blackwood made no further move to attack. Instead, she pointed to the hole. "Let it fall. Complete the circle." Blood dripped from Morgan's hand, spattering on the tangle of hands and the box of remains. As the first drops touched the ancient wood, a strange humming filled the air, like distant voices chanting in unison. The hands in the pit began to move again, not to escape, but to pull everything deeper, drawing the box down as if the earth itself was swallowing it. Morgan's blood seemed to accelerate the process, each drop causing the strange mass to sink further. "Cover it," the entity commanded. "Bury it completely." Working one-handed, Morgan and Eliza pushed dirt back into the hole, covering the writhing mass until it disappeared from view. When the last handful of soil was packed down, a shudder ran through Mrs. Blackwood's body, and she collapsed to the ground like a puppet whose strings had been cut. The humming grew louder, and the earth beneath their feet began to tremble. Cracks spread outward from the freshly filled hole, following the 4 roads of the crossroads like veins. "We need to get out of here," Morgan shouted over the noise, helping Eliza lift Mrs. Blackwood's unconscious form. They half-carried, half-dragged her to the car, the ground continuing to shake beneath them. As they drove away, Morgan glanced in the rearview mirror to see the center of the crossroads collapse inward, creating a perfect circular pit where their burial site had been. For a moment, he thought he saw something rising from the pit, a figure, tall and human-shaped, but with too many limbs, too many reaching hands, before it sank back into the darkness, and the earth closed over it like a healing wound. "Is it over?" Eliza asked, cradling Mrs. Blackwood's head in her lap. Morgan looked down at his bleeding palm, at the cut that followed his lifeline with strange precision. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I think we've changed something. Broken the cycle, maybe." As they drove home in the deepening night, none of them noticed the small sapling that had begun to grow at the center of the restored crossroads, a slender shoot with 5 tiny branches that, in the moonlight, looked remarkably like the fingers of a small, reaching hand. 3 days passed with no sign of the handman or its creations. The oak tree stood undisturbed, the ground beneath it showing no trace of the grotesque growth that had emerged there. Mrs. Blackwood recovered from her ordeal with no memory of being controlled, though she listened gravely when Morgan and Eliza explained what had happened. "The entity may be dormant, not destroyed," she warned them, sitting at their kitchen table with a cup of untouched tea before her. "These things have a way of returning, especially when blood is involved." Morgan unconsciously rubbed his palm, where the cut had healed with surprising speed, leaving a scar that precisely followed his lifeline. "What do you mean, when blood is involved?" Mrs. Blackwood sighed. "Blood seals pacts, Morgan. Your great-great-grandfather's deal likely involved his blood in some way, and now yours has joined it. There's a connection there, a thread that can't easily be severed." "But the hands are gone," Eliza pointed out. "The gold is buried. What else could happen?" "That's what concerns me," Mrs. Blackwood admitted. "The ritual you performed wasn't in any book I know. It was the entity itself that guided you through it. Why would it instruct you on how to bind it?" The question hung in the air, unanswered and unsettling. That night, Morgan dreamed of the crossroads. In his dream, he approached the center, where they had buried the hands and gold. The ground there was no longer sunken, but raised in a small mound, from which grew a young tree. Its trunk was smooth and pale, its 5 branches reaching toward the sky like fingers. As he watched, golden leaves sprouted from the fingertip branches, unfurling with a soft metallic sound. They caught the moonlight, glinting and flashing with each slight movement. And beneath the tree, partially exposed by eroding soil, lay a human skull, its empty eye sockets fixed on Morgan. He woke gasping, his scarred palm burning as if freshly cut. Just a dream, he told himself. But he couldn't shake the feeling that it was something more, a vision, perhaps, or a warning. The next morning, Morgan drove to the crossroads alone, needing to see for himself that everything was as they'd left it. The intersection looked normal at first glance, 4 dirt roads meeting in an unremarkable center. But as he approached on foot, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. A sapling, no more than 2 feet tall, grew at the exact center where they had buried the hands. Its trunk was unnaturally smooth and white, its branches, 5 of them, spread like an upturned palm. No leaves grew yet, but at the tip of each branch was a small bud, golden in color. Morgan approached cautiously, circling the sapling. The ground around it was unusually fertile-looking, the soil dark and rich compared to the dusty earth of the surrounding roads. And there, partially visible at the base of the trunk, was a smooth white object that looked disturbingly like the top of a human skull. His phone rang, startling him so badly he nearly dropped it. Eliza's name flashed on the screen. "You need to come home," she said without preamble, her voice tight with fear. "Something's happening to Mrs. Blackwood." Morgan drove well above the speed limit, reaching their cottage in half the usual time. Inside, he found Eliza kneeling beside Mrs. Blackwood, who lay on the living room floor, her body rigid, eyes rolled back to show only whites. "It started about 20 minutes ago," Eliza explained, her hands hovering helplessly over the older woman's form. She was talking about feeling strange, and then she just collapsed. "I can't wake her up." Morgan crouched beside them, noticing something odd about Mrs. Blackwood's hands. The fingers were unnaturally stiff, extended straight out, and the skin had taken on a waxy, pale appearance. As he watched, a faint golden discoloration began to spread across her palms. "I saw a tree at the crossroads," he told Eliza, his voice hushed, "growing exactly where we buried everything. It had 5 branches like fingers and golden buds." Eliza's eyes widened. You think it's starting again? That the ritual didn't work?" "I think it worked exactly as the handman intended," Morgan said grimly. "Remember what Mrs. Blackwood asked us? Why would it tell us how to bind it?" He looked down at the unconscious woman. "I don't think we destroyed it. I think we completed it, gave it a new form, a stronger one." Mrs. Blackwood's body suddenly convulsed, her back arching impossibly high. Her mouth opened in a silent scream, and gold coins spilled from her lips, clattering to the floor around her. "We have to get her out of here," Morgan decided, already moving to lift her. "Away from the coins, away from the crossroads." "Where?" Eliza asked, gathering her car keys. Morgan thought quickly. "The church. Consecrated ground. If this thing was originally buried at a crossroads because it couldn't rest in hallowed earth, maybe that's still true." They managed to get Mrs. Blackwood to Eliza's car, though her body had grown increasingly rigid, her limbs difficult to bend. The golden discoloration had spread up her arms now, and her skin had taken on the smooth, hard appearance of a statue. As they drove towards St. Andrew's Church on the edge of town, Morgan noticed something in the rearview mirror, tiny pale shapes moving along the road behind them. Hands, dozens of them crawling in pursuit. St. Andrew's Church stood on a hill overlooking the town, its stone walls weathered by centuries of rain and wind. The heavy wooden doors were unlocked. The church prided itself on remaining open to those in need at all hours. Morgan and Eliza carried Mrs. Blackwood's increasingly rigid form inside, struggling with her weight. The golden discoloration had spread to cover most of her body now, and her eyes remained open but unseeing, fixed on some distant point. The interior of the church was cool and dim, lit only by a few candles near the altar, and the colored light filtering through stained glass windows. They laid Mrs. Blackwood in a pew near the front, uncertain what to do next. "Will this work?" Eliza whispered, glancing nervously toward the doors. "Will being on consecrated ground protect her?" "I don't know," Morgan admitted. "But it's the only idea I have." A soft voice spoke from behind them. "What has happened to this woman?" They turned to find Father Thomas, the elderly parish priest, watching them with concern. His lined face showed no judgment, only genuine worry. Morgan hesitated, then decided on a version of the truth. "She's ill, Father. We believe she's under the influence of something malevolent." Father Thomas approached slowly, his eyes widening as he took in Mrs. Blackwood's golden-hued skin and unnatural rigidity. "This is no ordinary illness," he said quietly. "No," Morgan agreed. "It's not. We hoped that bringing her to consecrated ground might help." The priest studied Mrs. Blackwood for a long moment, then nodded thoughtfully. "There are old rituals for such things. Not often used in these modern times, but preserved nonetheless." He met Morgan's gaze directly. "Will you tell me what you know of this affliction?" They explained as best they could, omitting some of the more unbelievable details, but conveying the essence. A curse tied to gold coins, an entity collecting a debt, their attempt to end it that might have made things worse. Father Thomas listened without interruption, his expression growing increasingly grave. When they finished, he said, "I have heard legends of such things. Debt collectors who transcend death, curses that bind generations. In my younger days as a missionary, I encountered beliefs about entities that could manifest through objects, coins, statues, trees." "Can you help her?" Eliza asked, hope creeping into her voice. "I can try," the priest said, already moving toward the vestry. "Wait here! I'll gather what we need." While they waited, Morgan kept watch at the church doors, half expecting to see those crawling hands appear at any moment. The sun was setting now, casting long shadows across the churchyard. "Morgan," Eliza called softly, her voice tight with fear. "Look at her hands." Mrs. Blackwood's fingers had begun to change, elongating slightly, the joints becoming more pronounced. The golden color had deepened, taking on a metallic sheen that caught the candlelight. "It's still happening," Morgan said, returning to the pew. "Even here." Father Thomas emerged from the vestry, carrying a worn leather case and a small silver vessel of holy water. "We must act quickly," he said, taking in Mrs. Blackwood's worsening condition. "This ritual is ancient, predating much of church doctrine. It was used when Christianity first encountered older powers in these lands." He opened the case, revealing a silver crucifix, a small vial of oil, and several pressed herbs bound with red thread. "The entity you described, this handman, sounds like what our predecessors might have called a collector, a spirit that gathers debts and binds itself to material objects." As Father Thomas prepared for the ritual, Eliza suddenly gasped, pointing to the stained glass window above the altar. "Morgan, look!" The window depicted Christ with outstretched arms, surrounded by supplicants. But something was wrong with the image now. The hands of all the figures, Christ included, seemed to be detaching from their bodies, becoming separate entities, reaching toward the center of the composition. "It's coming," Morgan said, a chill running down his spine. "Even here." Father Thomas worked faster, placing the crucifix on Mrs. Blackwood's chest and anointing her forehead with the oil. "We must sever her connection to this entity," he explained, his voice steady despite the increasingly unsettling changes around them. "Break the thread that binds her to its influence." As he began to recite the ritual in Latin, the candles near the altar flickered violently. Shadows deepened in the corners of the church, taking on shapes that seemed to move independently of any light source. Morgan's scarred palm began to burn again, the pain increasing with each phrase of the ritual. He clenched his fist, trying to ignore it, but the sensation grew until it felt as if his hand were being sliced open anew. "Morgan," Eliza whispered, pointing to his closed fist. "You're bleeding." He opened his hand to find blood welling from the scar, running between his fingers to drip onto the stone floor. Each drop seemed to sizzle slightly upon contact with the consecrated ground. Father Thomas, still reciting the ritual, gave Morgan a sharp look. "Your blood is part of this," he said between Latin phrases. "You've been marked as a conduit. What does that mean?" Morgan asked, trying to stanch the flow with his shirt sleeve. "It means," the priest replied grimly, "that the entity can reach through you, use you as a doorway. Your blood connects you to it." As if in response to his words, the bleeding intensified, and with it came a new sensation, a tugging, a pulling, as if something were trying to draw something out of Morgan through the wound. Father Thomas pressed the crucifix more firmly against Mrs. Blackwood's chest, his voice rising. The ritual was reaching its climax, the ancient words echoing in the high-ceiling church. Suddenly, Mrs. Blackwood's back arched violently, her mouth opening in a silent scream. From her throat emerged a sound that was not human, a high, thin keening that made the stained glass vibrate in its frames, and from her mouth a golden coin slowly emerged, followed by another and another. They spilled onto her chest, rolling across the crucifix and onto the floor with metallic clinks. "Don't Don't touch them, Father Thomas warned as Eliza instinctively reached for one. They are conduits, just like the blood. The bleeding from Morgan's palm had become a steady stream now, forming a small puddle on the stone floor. As he watched in horror, the blood began to move, not spreading randomly, but forming precise lines, drawing a pattern that resembled a crossroads. It's fighting back, Father Thomas said, his voice strained. The ritual is working, but the entity is strong. It's trying to establish a new connection, a new conduit. Outside the church, thunder rolled across the sky, though there had been no storm in the forecast. The windows rattled in their frames, and a cold wind seemed to sweep through the building despite the closed doors. And then, from outside, came a sound that made Morgan's blood run cold, a soft scratching. The sound of many small things moving across stone. The hands had found them. The scratching grew louder, moving from the outer walls to the heavy wooden doors. The handles rattled, testing their strength. "Continue the ritual," Morgan told Father Thomas, moving toward the entrance. "Eliza, help him. I'll try to keep them out." He reached the doors, just as the first cracks appeared between them, pale fingers forcing their way through, pushing and prying. Morgan threw his weight against the wood, but the pressure from outside was immense, as if dozens of hands were working in concert. Behind him, Father Thomas's voice rose in volume, the ritual reaching its climax. Mrs. Blackwood's body convulsed repeatedly on the pew, more coins emerging from her mouth with each spasm. The golden color was fading from her skin now, receding like an ebbing tide. "It's working," Eliza called to Morgan, her voice barely audible over the increasing cacophony. The ritual Latin, the thunder outside, the scratching and pounding at the doors. The bleeding from Morgan's palm had slowed, but the pattern drawn by his blood on the stone floor had completed itself, a perfect crossroads symbol. And at its center, something was beginning to emerge from the stone itself, a small, pale shoot that grew even as he watched, reaching upward like a finger. The tree, he realized. It's trying to grow here inside the church. One of the doors splintered suddenly, a hand pushing fully through the gap. It was larger than the others they'd seen, almost the size of a human arm. Its fingers unnaturally long and jointed. It groped blindly, searching for the handle on the inside. Morgan looked around desperately for a weapon, something to fight back with. His gaze fell on the small silver vessel of holy water Father Thomas had brought out. Without hesitating, he lunged for it, grabbed it, and returned to the doors. As the large hand found the inner handle and began to turn it, Morgan poured the holy water directly onto it. The effect was instantaneous and horrifying. The hand convulsed, the fingers curling in agony. A high, thin scream came from outside, and the pressure on the doors momentarily ceased. Taking advantage of the reprieve, Morgan dragged a heavy wooden pew across the entrance, barricading the doors. It wouldn't hold forever, but it might buy them time. He returned to find Father Thomas completing the ritual, making the sign of the cross over Mrs. Blackwood's now still form. The golden hue had completely disappeared from her skin, and her breathing had returned to normal, though she remained unconscious. "Is she free?" Morgan asked, eyeing the pile of gold coins that had emerged from her mouth, at least 24 of them, scattered across the pew and floor. Father Thomas nodded wearily. "I believe so. The entity has relinquished its hold on her." He glanced at the barricaded doors, which had begun to rattle again, but it has not given up. "It will find another way, another conduit." Morgan looked down at his bleeding palm, then at the small sapling growing from the center of the blood-drawn crossroads on the floor. It had already grown to nearly a foot in height, its 5 branches stretching upward like fingers. "It's using me," he said, understanding dawning. "My blood, my connection to the original deal. That's why the ritual didn't stop it completely, because I'm still bound to it." Father Thomas studied him intently. "The blood debt of your ancestor," he said slowly. "It passed to you when you accepted the gold, and it remains even though you tried to return it. So how do I break it?" Morgan demanded, acutely aware of the increasing pressure on the barricaded doors. How do I end this for good? The priest hesitated. In the old stories, blood debts could only be settled in one of two ways: repayment in full or sacrifice. Sacrifice. Eliza echoed, her face pale. What kind of sacrifice? The debtor himself, Father Thomas said quietly. A life to cancel the debt. Morgan felt a cold certainty settle over him. That's what it's always wanted. Not just to pass along the curse, but to claim a thorn, to complete the circle. The barricade at the doors gave way with a splintering crash. Ends poured into the church, skittering across the stone floor with unnatural speed. Among them walked a figure that made Morgan's heart stop, a humanoid shape composed entirely of interlocked hands and arms, with a head formed of palms, facing outward in all directions. Like a grotesque flower in bloom, the handman had manifested fully. Get Mrs. Blackwood out, Morgan told Eliza, moving to place himself between the advancing horror and the others. Use the side door near the altar. I'm not leaving you, Eliza protested. You have to, Morgan insisted. This is between me and it now. Always has been. Father Thomas grasped Eliza's arm. He's right, we must go. This is his battle to fight. As they lifted Mrs. Blackwood and retreated toward the side exit, the handman approached Morgan, its movement a strange gliding punctuated by the sound of dozens of fingers tapping against stone. It stopped a few feet away, the palms that formed its head turning to focus on him like bizarre eyes. You know what I want, came a voice. Not from the creature itself, but seeming to emerge from the very air around them. What is owed? What was promised? Morgan straightened his shoulders. My ancestor's debt. His life, yes, the voice agreed. A thorn's life, freely given. That was the original bargain. The sapling growing from the blood-drawn crossroads had continued to grow, now nearly as tall as Morgan himself. Its branches had developed golden buds that were beginning to unfurl into leaf-like shapes. If I agree, Morgan said carefully, it ends. The curse is lifted from my family, from Eliza, forever. The handman inclined its bizarre head. The debt will be settled. The cycle complete. Morgan thought of his sister, of the life she could have free from this shadow that had hung over their family for generations. He thought of Mrs. Blackwood and all the others who had been caught in the curse's web over the years. And he made his decision. Then take me, he said, extending his bleeding palm toward the entity. And this. The handman moved forward with that strange gliding motion, reaching for Morgan with multiple arms. The moment it touched him, an excruciating pain shot through his body, as if every nerve ending had been set alight. He fell to his knees, gasping. Through the haze of agony, he saw the hand tree growing from his blood accelerate its growth, stretching upward until it nearly touched the high ceiling of the church. The golden leaf shapes unfurled fully, revealing themselves to be not leaves at all, but coins, hundreds of them, hanging like bizarre fruit. The handman began to change as well, its form becoming more cohesive, more human-like. The random assembly of hands and arms arranged themselves into a more recognizable shape, a tall, slender figure with a face that almost resembled a man's. Though still formed of smaller palms and fingers, the debt is nearly settled, the voice said, growing stronger, more focused. Your life force feeds the tree, completes my transformation. Soon I will be whole again. Morgan could barely speak through the pain, but he managed to gasp. And my family will be free? The handman tilted its head, an eerily human gesture. Free of their debt to me, yes. As promised, something in the phrasing made Morgan's fading consciousness spark with alarm. There was a loophole here, some trick he was missing. With enormous effort, he forced his mind to work, to understand what was happening. The tree, he realized. It wasn't just growing from his blood. It was consuming him, transforming his life energy into something else. And when it was complete, the handman would be fully manifested, no longer bound to coins or crossroads or ancient pacts. It would be free to make new deals, claim new victims. He hadn't ended the cycle. He'd completed it. With the last of his strength, Morgan pulled himself toward the base of the tree. His hand closed around one of the gold coins that had fallen from Mrs. Blackwood. and he pressed it into the earth at the tree's roots. "I return what was taken," he whispered, echoing the ritual they had performed at the crossroads. "I complete the circle." The coin sank into the ground as if it were liquid, disappearing from view. For a moment nothing happened. Then the tree shuddered, its branches trembling. The golden coins hanging from its branches began to fall, raining down around Morgan. The handman made a sound, a high, thin scream of rage or pain. "What have you done?" the voice demanded, no longer smooth and confident but sharp with fear. Morgan smiled weakly. "Repaid the debt. My ancestor took your gold, made a deal he didn't honor. Now I'm giving it back, all of it. Every coin that passed through every hand in this chain of misery." The tree was changing now, the branches curling inward, the trunk beginning to twist and contract. The handman lunged for Morgan, but its form was already destabilizing. The hands and arms that composed it losing cohesion, falling apart. "You cannot end me," the voice insisted, though it was fading. "The debt is settled," Morgan finished for it. "In full, no more deals, no more victims, no more handman." A blinding light filled the church, so intense that Morgan had to close his eyes against it. The pain that had been consuming him began to recede, replaced by a strange, floating sensation, as if he were drifting away from his own body. When the light faded and he could open his eyes again, the hand tree was gone. In its place was a small pile of ordinary soil, with a single gold coin resting on top, one of the original 7. Morgan somehow knew that had started all of this. The handman had vanished as well, along with all of its crawling hands. The church was quiet, the storm outside having passed as suddenly as it had arrived. Morgan struggled to his feet, surprised to find that he could. The weakness and pain had diminished, though he felt oddly hollow, as if something essential had been taken from him. The side door opened cautiously, and Eliza peered in, her face tight with worry. When she saw Morgan standing alone in the nave, she rushed to him, throwing her arms around him. "You're alive!" she breathed, holding him tightly. When I saw that light, I thought so too," Morgan admitted, returning her embrace. "But I found another way. A true settlement." Father Thomas entered behind Eliza, supporting the now conscious Mrs. Blackwood. The older woman looked exhausted, but herself again, the unnatural golden hue completely gone from her skin. "It's over," Morgan told them, bending to pick up the single remaining coin. "The debt is paid. The cycle broken." Mrs. Blackwood studied him with her sharp eyes. "At what cost?" she asked softly. "These entities don't relinquish their hold easily." Morgan opened his palm, revealing the coin. The scar that had followed his lifeline was now gold-tinged, a permanent reminder of his connection to the handman. "A piece of my life," he said simply. Not all of it, but enough to satisfy the debt. He would feel it in the years to come, a slight weakening, a few years shaved from his lifespan, perhaps. But he was alive and, more importantly, free. They all were. As they left the church together, Morgan glanced back at the spot where the hand tree had grown. Nothing remained now, not even the disturbed stone or the blood-drawn crossroads. It was as if none of it had ever happened, but in his pocket the weight of the coin reminded him otherwise. One coin, the last of its kind, kept as a reminder of what happens when debts go unpaid, when curses take root, when demons offer gold that carries too high a price. Later, he would bury it, not to hide it or pass it along, but to return it to the earth where it belonged, with a proper blessing and on consecrated ground. An ending, not a beginning. As dawn broke over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold that reminded him a little too much of those coins, Morgan felt something he hadn't experienced in months. Peace. The whispers were silent. The shadows were just shadows again, and the ancient oak on their property was just a tree, nothing more. Home. Eliza asked, linking her arm through his. Morgan nodded, a genuine smile spreading across his face. Home. Soft, intimate tone. The shadows have receded. For now, thank you for journeying with me into the darkness. These stories only live when shared with souls brave enough to listen. If you felt that chill down your spine, that's your sign to join our community of shadow seekers. Subscribe now to ensure you never miss the next tale waiting in the dark. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. What would you have done if faced with this nightmare? Your reactions feed the stories I tell. And if you found value in tonight's offering, remember that a simple like is the coin you leave at my doorstep. Though unlike the handman's gold, this exchange brings only good fortune. Until next time, keep one eye on the shadows. They're always watching, whispered. They're always listening.